Welcome to JJ, the JJ Dillon podcast. I, of course, am your co-host, JP John Paz. And with me, as always, is the star of the show, two-time Hall of Famer, the leader of the legendary Four Horsemen, the second greatest manager of all time, former WWF and WCW executive, James J. Dillon. JJ, how are you doing this evening?
Very, very good. And I hope you had a wonderful Thanksgiving as we are well into the holiday season, which is, I'm not crazy about cold weather. And in Delaware where I live, we, for the most part, don't have the real weather extremes, but, you know, it is seasonal weather, but it's a great time of the year with all the decorations up for holidays and just a good time. And of course, Thanksgiving usually involves turkey dinner with family, and mine was no different. And also was with friends up in Philadelphia, and a day with my one daughter, Pam, or Missy.
Very, very good. And speaking of Philadelphia, last weekend, the Icons Collectors Fest in Philadelphia at the old ECW Arena. Last weekend, we were able to touch base and hang out for a little bit, which was very, very cool for me. But for most of the day, obviously you were with Charlie, but you were also with the legendary Lariat, Stan Hansen. What was it like hanging out with Stan the Man?
Oh, it had been a while. And when we get a chance to sit down and start reminiscing stories, because we were a lot of the same places at the same time from the same era. And he's become a great friend over the years, and enjoy doing something like Philadelphia with somebody like Stan. We had a great time.
Very, very cool. And obviously, so many people will remember Stan for being such a tough, hard-nosed, stiff guy, but also being a legend in Japan, teaming with Bruiser Brody. I mean, he is a very, very memorable guy, and I'm sure you had a lot of great memories sharing with him.
Absolutely. And he lives in Colorado, and so I don't get to see him all that often. So this was really a special occasion. It really made the weekend for me. I enjoyed the time with him and with all the fans that came to share it with us.
Very, very cool. Now, this week on the show, we will be talking about another WWF topic from the early to mid-'90s, and that is, of course, another scandal, the steroid scandal, which was another bad controversy for the WWF. It seemed like one after another going on with the Terry Garvin situation that we talked about, with kind of Hogan on his way out and all this other stuff popping up. And then all of a sudden in 93, a little bit of a Vince McMahon trouble, if you will. I mean, Vince McMahon gets indicted by federal court over the steroid controversy. What was it like in the WWF at this time going on with the steroid controversy? Just absolutely nuts.
Yeah, it was a very tense time. And, of course, there was a newspaper in New York that were never big fans of Vince to start with. And so that really gave them something to jump on the publicity train. And unfortunately, it meant a lot of negative publicity in that era. And I was in charge of the drug enforcement program at that time for the company, or was placed in charge with it. And it was something that, and I had my own personal opinion when I came into the business as a young talent back in the 70s. The steroid thing was not a very big. There was something, a tablet called Hannibal that some guys took just to bulk up a little bit or add weight, and then people in the wrestling business interacted with a lot of weightlifters, and it eventually, over a period of time, the thing got to be a huge industry in and of itself with steroids. And even to this day, I think not everyone knows, for those that chose to use steroids for whatever the reason, no one knows what the long-term lingering effects are over the passing of time. I remember in the early days they talked about, well, it could affect your genitals, and maybe men that take steroids having trouble fathering children, and there was a lot of things, and I don't know how much was truth, how much was rumor. I was fortunate personally in that I was tall. I appeared bigger in the ring than my actual weight. If you put me on a scale and looked at me and say, "Oh, I thought you weighed more than that," and so I never was even tempted to want to get into the thing of of looking in the mirror and not being satisfied with what I saw. I wanted. I think it is important in our industry to have the appearance. And I go back to when I was a fan. When a wrestler walked through a door, you would do a double take because you'd say, "Hey, that person," even if you didn't know who it was or know them by name at the initial time, you would know they were somebody. And as time passed, and different eras, there were smaller guys that came into the business that had very successful careers. That the image of size wasn't as important as it was back when I first broke into the business.
And if you think about the WWF and what supposedly, quote unquote, Vince McMahon likes is those big, muscular guys. And of course, I think a lot of people realize, wow, that guy is huge. Maybe he's on something. He's on the gas or he's on the juice. They kind of just assume. And during that period, a lot of the guys obviously were, and some of them would get popped and everything else. So when Vince McMahon stood trial, as he basically has these very, very serious allegations that he is knowingly distributing steroids, were you kind of thinking like, wow, yeah, shit, or excuse my language, but wow, Vince is going to be in trouble for this?
Yeah, I was there at the time, and then steroids were a controlled substance. So when it involved rumors or proof of them being distributed, especially where across state lines, that became a criminal offense for sure. And so it was a tough time, and it came under a lot of scrutiny. And though I personally never took steroids, I was tall, so that helped me, and I had an athletic body, though I'd never had a like a weightlifter's wedge shape, big broad shoulders and tiny waist. I just was proportioned and big enough that I could have a successful career without ever having to worry about taking something to add weight to enhance my appearance. Because there was talk about, well, we don't know what the long-term effects of this is. Some of it was more immediate that the guys would talk about, and then it became something where, well, I will say this: I never ever heard any promoter. I'm not only talking about Vince McMahon. I'm not talking about any promoter who ever mandated, hinted, advocated for a wrestler to take any kind of substance to put on weight to enhance their size, which you could argue would probably make them maybe more marketable. It was an individual decision. There were guys that took it that felt that there were some guys who struggled with their appearance, looking at themselves in a mirror, and with that little bit of help and enhance their appearance, it was something that they totally embraced because they liked what they saw in the mirror. Thank God I never had that problem. I never even contemplated. And what would happen then too was, because there was an unknown thing of what the long-term effects are. They used to, I think they called it cycling, which was a term that guys working out in the gym that wanted to push more weight also would take steroids. And of course, a lot of wrestlers worked out in the gym. So that's where the steroid thing spilled over into the wrestling profession, because even guys that were just going to the gym to train. That's why every gym that I've ever been in, all I see from wall to wall is mirrors. Because guys like to train, pump up, and then like what they see in the mirror.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
And you know what I'm talking about. And so if they take something that enhances that a little bit, I can see where that is something that would be very attractive to some of those guys that, well, they think, I don't think there's any long-term harm in this. I'll take it for a couple of weeks, get off it for a week, and then, they convince themselves that they were minimizing any potential long-term effects, because at that point nobody really knew if there were any.
It's kind of crazy when you think about it, like, wow, these guys are getting big, they're getting bulked up, and all of a sudden, boom, the federal government's getting involved, and boom, they could get in trouble for it, and crossing state lines and different things like that. You almost don't even think about it. You're like, wow, these guys they look great. Like, look, oh wow, look at Warrior, look at Bulldog. Wow, they look great. You don't think like, wow, there's some serious ramifications if they get caught, or if they're selling it, or who they're buying it from. It is crazy. Was it scary being in charge of drug enforcement and the tests and stuff at that point, as far as your role?
There was pressure by media, because a big part of success in wrestling was not only what you're able to do mechanically and athletically, but what your physical appearance was. And if some guys were borderline, taking something to add that, even just 10, 15 pounds, could really make a difference in what their appearance was in the ring. And so that's why it was something that was it was very popular. Not supposedly, I know that they were originally, steroids were originally, I don't know, invented is the right word, or formulated for people who had suffered illnesses where they lost a lot of weight, and doctors prescribed them to help people, get back to their normal body weight. And then, of course, people in the wrestling business said, well, if somebody who's used to be 200 pounds and they're down to 160 because they were ill, and the doctor gives them a prescription to take these, and all of a sudden, it speeds up the process of them getting back to their natural body weight of 190 or 200 pounds. And in some cases, going over that number, or now they're 210, 215. And a lot of them noticed that, wow, they liked the difference in what their physical appearance was looking in the mirror. And that's what really motivated a lot of guys to do it. Because there are some guys who, if they didn't take steroids, may not have made it in the business, because what you did in the ring and all was very important. You had to, that was very competitive too. But I couldn't deny that a big part of the whole package was your appearance in the ring, what you look like. And there were a lot of guys who emphasized so much on their appearance, and promoters that were attracted to guys that had that appearance, many of whom were not very gifted athletically and were not great performers in the ring, but because of their look, were able to get into our business and make a living.
Now, any of those guys, not looked down upon, but were they like, man, by any other guys, saying man, that guy's just here because of his body, or man, if that guy wasn't on steroids, he wouldn't be in the WWF? Any of that kind of back talk, or any of that come to you and say oh, this guy shouldn't be here, or anything like that?
I can't remember, to be honest with you, hearing much conversation like that. Were there guys that probably thought it? Yeah, because there were guys that, the booker in most territories was somebody who was also working. It was very rare that you had somebody who was the booker who was not a talent. And so there were some guys that used to say, well, he's on top, he's featured, he's in the programs, he's making more money, and the only reason is because he's the booker, and that's where he books himself. And it probably was true to a degree. So there was always talk, and there were guys that you would make a trip in the car, and you might be just two of you in the car, where they would maybe, if they got to know you on a personal level, would speak more freely and openly than they would if they were in a group in the car with maybe four people. And there were some that felt that certain guys got pushed stronger, more television time, more featured spots because of their size, and they felt in many cases that size, that appearance, was because of steroids.
Absolutely. I can think of, I'm not going to really mention, but I can think of so many guys like, wow, that guy is huge, and probably why they're using him, or that's why he's on TV. Maybe he's not a great worker. Maybe he doesn't have great charisma, but I mean, man, this guy's got a great look. But thinking about that time period, and you mentioned that there's no promoter that you ever seen that mandated, hey, you got to take steroids. But it was kind of known, or somewhat known, that Vince himself was using steroids and was taking steroids. I mean, he was huge and still is to this day. Huge guy. Was that one of those things where the wrestlers were like, hey, with the owners doing it, it's okay for us to do it?
I don't remember it being talked about openly, but I'm sure, because Vince trained hard too, because we did a lot of work on the creative side, as I've said before. At it, most of it was done at his home, like on weekends. But either he'd have a workout before, a workout after. So Vince was very fit, and he trained hard. And most guys that train and have good results like what they see in the mirror, and that's part of what motivates them to keep doing what they're doing, and some even to push harder and to try and get even bigger.
At this point, when it's going on, and first you start hearing about it and stuff, and you're in charge of kind of getting these guys and getting them drug tested and things like that, anything like before that were like they were really talking about steroids, or they only really kind of focused in on steroids when Vince really got in trouble for it? Like, was there any was this all a reaction, or was there anything beforehand kind of put in place to kind of block steroid use?
I feel that the publicity from the one newspaper in New York that was not a big fan of Vince, really scrutinized the possibility that there were steroids, and triggered additional scrutiny. And for me personally, and I was put in charge of the drug program, and the deal was that in order for it to have credibility, there was a doctor who was in charge of the program, and I worked one-on-one with him. And the deal was he would determine, so that it did remain totally random, he would determine when there was going to be a test. And he would be the one to contact. He had a list of doctors where he would contact the doctor, and then late in that same day, right before I would leave to go to the arena, so I would get a call basically saying, make sure you're one of the first people there tonight, because that we're having a test tonight. So I didn't have much advance warning, which was a good thing, so that nobody could ever say that, well, I told somebody, in advance. In other words, there was a true faith effort to try to make it as legitimate as possibly could be the case, and that I feel good about that. and it was a legitimate program. Now, the thing that I struggle with was that, yes, okay, steroid use is illegal unless it's prescribed by a doctor. And if somebody's not recovering from some kind of an illness and where it's prescribed by a doctor to make sure that person puts weight back on and get their body weight back up, in the absence of that, it's therefore illegal, which was readily available. Guys could get it. Because the medical profession, I guess, didn't look at it as something that it wasn't like, cocaine is an example. It wasn't something like that was considered a hard drug. And so steroids were, though not being used as they were initially intended for somebody recovering from an illness where they lost a lot of weight and to help them to get back to their normal weight, it now was something that was being used for an entirely different purpose, which was to enhance whoever chose to take them, their appearance. And I, even though I was in charge of the program, I never had a problem with. In other words, I didn't take it because I didn't feel the need to. I looked in the mirror and could I have been bigger? Yeah. But I also was not somebody that went to the gym and pumped weights and was a gym rat, because I wasn't. It's just I was tall, gave the appearance in the ring of being bigger than what my natural weight would indicate if you met me outside the ring. And I guess somebody could have made a case. Well, if you took something and could put on another 15 pounds or something, boy, that would really change your look for the better, and maybe that would translate into moving up the card and being used differently because of your appearance. And I think that's what a lot of guys did. They looked in the mirror and they made a conscious decision of, I don't look a whole lot different than anybody else or somebody walking off the street, so I need that help. And it became a individual decision. And as I said, I never heard a promoter to say to somebody, well, I can book you or I can use you better if you take something and look bigger than what I'm looking at right now, other than what you would do if you were not somebody who trained hard in the gym with weights and what have you, and made a conscious effort to work out harder in the gym and to put on weight as a result of training and not as a result of anything that you took into your body in the way of a chemical.
Now, I may have a different kind of thought on this, but technically speaking, pro wrestling isn't a real sport. Not to sound crazy or anything, but let's be honest, it's not a real sport. So what would steroids, if someone would take steroids, what's the advantage of taking it besides looking great? Shouldn't all wrestlers aspire to look great? You know what I mean? I have a weird feeling like, if it's baseball, yes, okay, they're cheating for an advantage. If it's football, yes, they're cheating for an advantage. Whatever. Isn't it a little different wrestling? Isn't that kind of weird that they were coming after them so hard for steroid use when it's just kind of, it's a performance. It's not technically a real sport. Am I crazy in thinking that?
Well, a lot of guys felt that by taking steroids, increase their, they would have more fluid retention in their body, so that they would add weight. And if you looked at a before and after picture, you could say, wow, yeah, I can see this. The guy, I can see the difference. And if you're in a competitive business where fans look at somebody, and a guy can be great at mechanics and techniques in the ring, but not have the appearance. Appearance was a big part of it, that fans look at somebody and form an immediate impression or a first impression of what somebody looks like in the ring. And there's little things that guys could do, like Um, like if some guys that didn't have big legs could, there's one guy who is, I don't want to single his name out and mention it, who was at the top of our game, who did not have big calves. And he wore a higher boot that actually had like implants in the back of the boot that gave the appearance of having bigger calves than what he really had.
Huh.
So that aspect of it was very real, even for people at the highest level. They wanted to look the best that they could be, and it's very competitive. So if two guys were standing side by side and one guy was 15 pounds, if their natural weight would have been exactly the same, but the one guy is taking steroids and is now 15 pounds heavier than what his normal body weight would be without them. A lot of times, if you're looking at the two of them and which guy do you want to give a push to, without getting into, well, I really shouldn't pick this guy because he's doing something the other guy isn't. But it's a very competitive business. And if you see a guy that has a better look for you and thinks that you can do more with him, he's a guy you're going to go with. And if it's because he's taking steroids, that is a personal decision that he made. It's not like you mandated that he do it so that he does get that opportunity. I don't know if that makes sense to you or if that's crazy, but
yeah,
that's the reality of how it was.
So we're talking about doctors and stuff like that, and obviously Dr. George Sahorian, will pop up anytime you start talking about this drug test. Who is he really? I mean, we know he's a commissioned doctor for the state of Pennsylvania, but I mean, who is he to the WWF as far as pushing drugs and getting them stuff? Is he just a doctor that a lot of the wrestlers knew would get them steroids and get them stuff?
I think that's what happened because he was a commissioned doctor, so he was assigned at most, if virtually not all of the events in eastern Pennsylvania, and would spill over outside the borders of Pennsylvania. So he became something that the talent were very familiar with, and I never got into investigating him, but it was rumored that he could get stuff for the guys that wanted it.
Now, he obviously plays a big role, and he's going to be in a little bit of trouble himself. I don't even know how to word it, but did Vince and him have a relationship, or you would have no idea about that?
I would have no idea about that. I don't know.
Because obviously if the guys know him or getting stuff for him, different things are going to pop up, and maybe Vince will pop up on who he does to, sells to and things like that. But obviously the feds were on to him and they're on to Vince. So Vince has to put someone else in charge for the meantime. And he apparently, it says that now in charge of WWF is Linda McMahon. He puts his wife in charge for the time being. Was that fake, or was she really in charge of the WWF for a period of time?
She was in charge, and she, on the fourth floor of Titan Tower, Vince had an office at one end overlooking the beautiful view, because he had windows on the corner overlooking the sound out there. It was just gorgeous. And adjacent to his one wall, my office was on the other side of the wall, where I had an okay view out the window. And at the other end of the hall, was a bigger set of offices, and that was Linda's office, both on the fourth floor. And Linda was a very, very smart businesswoman, very smart. And so a lot of the business decisions, things regarding licensing, merchandising, those kind of things, that was her bailiwick, and she was very good at it.
What was she like as a person? A lot different than Vince? Nicer, easier to deal with? Anything like that?
Um, I love, I get along great with both of them. Uh, I don't even know how to answer that. I mean,
Hmm.
because I did a lot of work at the house with Pat, and when Pat was on hiatus, I was there with just Vince and I, and because one thing about Vince, he was hands on with everything involved with the product. So during the week, if they had, you know, pay-per-view coming up, and they were going to put a poster, the poster for the event. Vince would have to. He would maybe look at several options, and he would be the one to have the final decision on making the pick. When a new talent would come in, Vince would interview them, and I would be part of that process. And Vince would try to find out about their background, what they did, and a lot of times, if it wasn't obvious or if he didn't have a strong preconceived notion of what he wanted to do with that person character-wise, he would then send them off to a department that did the costume designs and so forth. And a lot of times, if he didn't have a preconceived direction that he wanted to take, he would turn it over to them and say, "You guys look at him, and you're looking at him now from a whole different perspective, and brainstorm on what you think. Give me some feedback, give me some ideas for a potential character." And that did happen a lot, where they would come back with a couple ideas where they would look at any one individual and create drawings with outfit and whatever, and Vince would look at it and sometimes, wow, I love that. And the other big part of it is that he wanted the talent to feel good about whatever direction you were going to take them, persona-wise, character-wise. And that's why a lot of times, if you could find something in their past, like Big Boss Man worked, he worked in corrections or law enforcement or something. So that was then an area where, wearing blues and carrying a nightstick wasn't totally foreign to him. You weren't giving him something so far from anything that he'd ever done. And Vince tried to do that as much as possible. And every now and then, the people that did costumes and what have you would take somebody and see something in him that maybe I wouldn't or Vince wouldn't, and they would come back and they would have a drawing and they'd say, "Boy, somebody or a couple of people in the group said this guy would be great as this," and give you, and a lot of times that was what we would end up running with.
And speaking of kind of those crazy characters during that time, and the guy Big Boss Man feuded with was Nails, Kevin Wachholtz. So when he comes out as one of the prosecution's witnesses during this thing and says that, "Oh yeah, Vince, he made us use drugs. It was an order by Vince." And obviously, Jerry McDevitt, the great WWF head attorney, great lawyer, kind of basically killed his credibility and all that other stuff in court. But when Nails comes out and says stuff like that, does anybody believe him, or is his credibility kind of shot? We're like, okay, he just hates Vince. They got into a physical confrontation. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that. Yep. They got into physical confrontation. So does he have credibility there, or is no one really buying what Nails is saying?
It depends on what side of the fence you lean towards. That if you, I'm not sure how I could find the words. It's like people could take a position and convince themselves, and this is a bad example. I talk about something biblical, but there's somebody that could have a position and point to certain passages in the Bible that say, "Boy, it very clearly is here. It says this," and then somebody else can look at the opposite end of the spectrum and quote from other chapters in the Bible that say direct the opposite. So it's like, if you have a strong feeling about something, you could come up with some kind of justification or whatever that maybe it only convinces you, or you still feel strongly about it, and end up convincing others to your point of view.
Now, that physical confrontation, it's so rumored that Nails beat the crap out of him. I was choking him, all this other stuff. Do you remember what happened in that fight? That obviously pre the steroid trial and pre him saying all this bad stuff about Vince WWF. But do you remember that fight at all?
Yeah, I was there that night, and oftentimes, Pat or myself would be in there, so there would be somebody else in the room. And then I don't remember what the circumstances were that night, because there was so much going on at TVs that they were, just the two of them were in the room, and all of a sudden there was some scuffling where, some furniture getting knocked over, and it all happened very quickly. And it got Nails out of the, and he alleged that, Vince made an inappropriate physical advance to him. I wasn't there in the room. It was not consistent with anything that I'd ever seen from Vince, which is not to say that I guess it couldn't have happened, but it was really out there in my opinion. And nobody will know, because there's only the two of them in that room. And I think after that, we always try to make sure that there was always a third person in the room, so that something like that couldn't happen again, where it's, he said type of thing.
So crazy thinking about like Nails beating up the owner and like choking him, and like it's like what, like how does that like escalate into that? I mean, who knows what Nails is saying, if it's true or not true. But it's just crazy to think.
It all happened very quickly. People stormed in the room, and it was over almost within moments after it started. I mean, it's just like, whoa, if there's a meeting in the room, you don't expect this, all of a sudden a chair or something get knocked over, and it's like, oh, and it wasn't like when he met with talent that the door was locked and there was nobody else in the room. Pat could go in there, I could go in there, and maybe we were doing other things, and a conversation might start between Vince and the talent, and then we would come in and sit down and just be there for whatever input we may have, or just to listen in on what was said.
Now, as far as Nails saying that Vince ordered him to use steroids and stuff, the only problem with that is their big star witness, the biggest of them all, the best ever, the biggest name in WWF history, Hulk Hogan, the key witness, says the opposite and said Vince never ordered them. But the thing is, Hogan does say that Vince did use them. So Vince was mad on one instance that he's saying that Hogan, this is saying that Vince did use them. But the other instance, he's kind of getting Vince off and basically getting him out of trouble by saying, of course he never ordered us to use it. What was your kind of take on Hogan at this point? Because he is ripping Vince in one instance, kind of, or telling the truth, I guess you could say, but he's also kind of exonerating him as well.
Yeah, and that's another way you could look at it. If you're being an outsider and being objective, you could say, well, by that comment, it basically legitimizes the whole thing. That he doesn't completely whitewash Vince and say this guy was. It's to me, it sounds like a very logical, honest story.
Mm-hmm. Yep,
that was my take on it.
And if you think about it, when Vince is eventually exonerated, it did bring just horrible, horrible negative publicity to WWF, just this whole thing. But with Hogan kind of saying that, it's got to breathe kind of a fresh air. WWF, was that the case, or was it like, well, we didn't think Vince was going to get in trouble anyway, but this is a huge blow? Or is it like, oh, thank God, we all thought Vince was going to jail. Thank God he got out.
There were times when Pat was there and the creative was being done on weekends with Vince, Pat, and myself. And so we could talk very openly, whether it was about talent, whether it was about something, a match, it was, you didn't feel of the three of us that we had to be guarded what we said to Vince, either whether it was a comment or whatever. It was, which I think is a big reason why it was a time where the company was so successful, because of three people that were making creative decisions and carrying them out, there was a genuine camaraderie between the three of us. He was the boss. We were working for him, but it was a very, very comfortable working relationship from my standpoint.
Were you worried about him going to jail?
Well, that's the other thing I was going to say, that more than one occasion, with Vince would say, with just he, Pat, and I, he would say, well, you guys need to take good notes, and Vince was convinced that, and his logic, which made sense, is when the government spends time and money and effort, they're going to get their pound of flesh. And Vince was convinced that because of that they were going to get him for something. And he was convinced that he was probably going to go to jail for some period of time, maybe not a long time, but he was convinced that when the government's out to get you, they're going to get you, and I'm no different, and they're probably going to hang something on me, and I'm going to end up doing time. And he used to joke, he said, you and Pat, I have to come up on visiting days and bring your yellow pads with you and take notes. and the company's got to keep rolling, and you guys would be the guys that are doing it while I'm not free to be there sitting with you. And he'd laugh about it.
Wow.
That conversation happened more than once.
So he was kind of legit nervous and worried. What were the talks like? Let's say, he goes to jail. Is this the point where he's like, okay, I'm bringing in Jerry Jarrett and he's going to replace me and he's going to be the head of the WWF?
There was a period of time there where he was convinced that this was about to happen. And I don't know how it I think we would talk openly, and I would say, well, Pat and I could, because we've been here a long time with you, Pat longer than me. We know, we without just bluntly saying it, but especially with Pat, he knew what Vince's likes were and what his dislikes were. So that things that he knew that Vince wouldn't like never got put on the table. Because Pat would say, no, Vince will never go for that. Let's not waste time and effort. And we're not going to try and sell him on something that he's just totally against. And Pat knew Vince really well. And there was plenty of other directions that we could go without saying, okay, we got to pick something that we feel strongly about, even if Vince doesn't, and we got to make him see it our way. Never got into those kind of discussions because it was just, it would have been wasted energy, to be honest with you.
Was Jerry Jarrett ever hired by WWF at that point?
What happened was Vince was convinced that he was going to do some time. And he said that we should prepare ourselves for that, what I don't want to use the word eventuality, but that's the word that immediately comes to mind. In other words, he felt that strongly that the government's out to get him. They're going to get him for something, even if it's a short-term thing. And that Pat and I had our hands full, and Vince, yes, we could go and visit him and bring our pads and take notes, but somebody has to be hands-on that's that's at Vince's level running the company. And I told Vince, I said, there's one guy out there who I've worked for, who's the only guy I can think of who has done what you do. And by that, I mean oversees television, oversees every aspect of the business. And I said, the only difference is that he's obviously done it on a much smaller scale. And he said, who is that? I said, Jerry Jarrett. He said, you have a relationship with Jerry? I said, yep. He said, would you have Jerry give me a call? So I get a hold of Jerry. Jerry calls Vince. They talked for a couple hours. And this went on for a couple weeks. And then finally, Vince says to me, I'd like to, they hit it off very well right from day one. And he said to me, I'd like to have Jerry come up here. And so that was proposed. And I talked to Jerry. And at that point, his son was the captain and quarterback of the football team in high school and played on Fridays. And so Jerry said, I don't want to, one thing, first of all, I wouldn't want to move up there. It's not like he was looking for a job or Jerry didn't need to be there financially or in any other way. And the fact that he wanted to be home every Friday to see his son play football and have the weekend at home with his family. So I relayed that to Vince, and he said, no problem. He said, he can fly in on Monday. We put him in a really nice hotel, and Thursday evening or Friday morning, depending on the circumstances, he flies home, so he's there and not at risk of missing his son play football. And he even said the number was that he wanted to pay Jerry under those arrangements was substantial, and he said, and I will do it in the form of a contract. Talk to Jerry. Jerry said, okay, so it's like, first of all, he wanted Jerry to come up and spend a little time with Vince to make sure that that was something that Jerry would be comfortable with. So for 3 weeks, Jerry came up and actually lived in Vince's house. Had meals there, slept in the house, stayed with him. On the weekends, still went home. And then that just gave Vince a chance to really get to know Jerry, and that everything that I had said about him, that I thought that he was the only person in the industry that I felt on a much smaller scale had been involved in an operation in Memphis where he oversaw everything, TV and everything, much like Vince did, but obviously a much smaller scale. So it was okay to have Jerry move up, and then we were going to find him an apartment to live in. He would come up on Monday, be there for the week. Thursday night or Friday morning, he would then fly home, be there for his son's football game, and then be with his family for the weekend, and then fly back up. And then so we'll give him and it was really he really paid him well. And so this was at a time when Vince was convinced that the government was going to get him for something. And his logic was, any time that they spend the kind of money that they've spent and the effort that they've done, they're going to find something to get me on, just to justify all the effort that they put in and the expense they put in to do it. Now that never happened. They never got to that point. And so when it became obvious that Vince was not going to go in jail, and the emphasis of a need for somebody to be in Vince's role had changed, then Jerry said, it makes no sense for me to keep coming up here. You're paying my airfare up here. You're paying me a fee, and you're not going anywhere. You're going to continue to run your own business. So meanwhile, he'd been under a contract. So Jerry was, I worked for Jerry. So he's one of those people that I have tremendous respect for and admiration for his knowledge of the business. He is the closest that I've come to in all my years in the business, and I've worked for just about everybody that I could say would come close to what Vince's role was with his company, again, only on a little bit of a smaller scale. So finally, Jerry said, Vince, you're obviously, your worst fear is not coming to fruition. They're not going to get you. You don't have to go to jail. It doesn't make sense for me to keep coming up here. And Vince said, okay. And then because we had put him under a contract, Jerry called me and he said, you're paying me well, and I have like a year contract, and let's void the contract. There's no need for me to come up there, and there's no need for to continue paying me because the scenario has all changed. So I went to Vince and I said, Jerry wants to basically void the contract and doesn't want you to continue paying him. And Vince said, he's a stand-up guy, and I want to honor the term of the contract, continue to pay him. I called Jerry and I said, Vince will not even entertain the idea of voiding the contract, and you're going to continue to get checks. And because Vince feels that it was offered to you in good faith, you were ready to come here in good faith, and he doesn't want to void the contract. He wants to honor it. And Jerry continued to get paid for it that year, and a lot of money. And it was Jerry who suggested, because the deal had changed, to void the contract. He didn't want to take money that he didn't feel he was earning. So it says a lot about Vince. It says a lot about Jerry.
Absolutely. That is crazy and just awesome on kind of both their parts. And you're right, both definitely stand-up guys as far as that.
Yep.
So Vince gets exonerated. What happens now with like the steroid policy? Is he crazy about it? Like, hey, we got to cut this crap out. Like, is he even more kind of crazy at this, or is he the same almost? Like, okay, we'll just keep doing what we're doing. Make sure that you're being drug tested, or did he kind of go over the top with it?
No, it was because I was put in charge of it. Continue to do what I was doing, and what would happen is that Vince was not mentioned in the written policy. Linda helped draft the written policy, and I was named as the company representative in charge of and overseeing the drug policy, and that I would work one-on-one with the doctor. He would determine when the random tests were, and he would call me just hours before and tell me that they were going to have a test that night, so nobody else knew, and I would tell the agent, in which by that conversation, he would have an idea, and I'd say, just make sure that you're not late getting there tonight. I want you the first one in the door. And so that was kind of, whoa, okay. But it also wasn't early enough that they could then, in theory, start calling all the guys, say, oh, there's going to be a test coming. There wasn't time for that either. So it didn't, in my opinion, in any way tarnish the credibility of their program. That was a very legitimate program. And when there was a random test, and if somebody failed the test, the doctor would call. He would call me. Vince was out of it, totally out of it. He would call me, and Um, the deal was, I think the first thing was like 3 weeks. You're off immediately 3 weeks and no pay. And then the second one was more stern. The third one was 3 strikes, you're out. But it was a legitimate policy. I was in charge of it. Vince had nothing to do with it, and I worked one-on-one with the doctor that was overseeing it.
It is the dawning, pretty much after this, the dawning of the new generation. So Hogan's on his way out. He heads to WCW, and then really this would be the beginning of the new generation and kind of starting basically anew. The pun intended. I mean, they're starting new with all these guys, getting rid of the steroid guys, and they're going to maybe just kind of elevate him and push some guys, and some naturally big guys like Undertaker's going to get even more of a push, and Diesel and Brett, who's not a steroid guy at all, is going to be kind of the face of the company as your pure wrestler. Shawn Michaels would be getting a little bit of a push. Jerry Lawler is obviously going to be a top heel. Then you got the Diesels, Undertaker, Yokozuna, Mabel, Duke the Dumpster Drosties of the world, Scott Hall, who were just naturally big. Was that kind of the thing by Vince? Is like, well, we won't have big guys from steroids. We're just going to get naturally big guys, or guys like Brett, who are really good wrestlers, and will show that the steroid era is gone.
I don't know that he broke it down that specifically, but I think that was what Vince was saying. In other words, we're going to have and continue to have a legitimate drug testing program, and it's like once the guys know that it is legitimate, that they're going to get a random test, not be warned in advance, and if you fail the test, you're looking at 3 weeks off with no pay, with no exclusions, no exceptions. So talent knew then that this thing was dead serious. I'm in charge of it. There's no input from Vince. If there's a test and somebody fails, the doctor calls me. I call the talent and tell them you're off 3 weeks. Go home.
Just like that.
Just like that.
Wow. I think that is a kind of perfect stopping point. This